you enjoyed this podcast, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. Sharing it with your friends and family helps spread knowledge, and when we help others grow, we grow too. Thank you so much for listening. Let's dive into the podcast. Chapter 1, Storms on the Horizon, Scandinavia Before the Raids. Part 1, Land of Fjords and Fire. Life in pagan Scandinavia. The cold waters of the North Sea crashed against jagged cliffs, while fishing boats bobbed in deep fjords that cut like scars through the mountainous coastline. This was Scandinavia in the 8th century, a land where towering forests met endless seas and winter darkness lasted for months. The people who called this harsh place home had learned to survive where others might perish. Every spring, when ice finally released its grip on the harbors, families gathered to repair their boats and prepare fishing nets. The sea provided what the rocky soil could not. Barley and rye grew in scattered fields between the forests, but harvests were uncertain. Fish, seal meat, and whale oil sustained communities through the brutal winters. Women spun wool while men carved wood and hammered iron, creating tools that could withstand the demanding environment. The boats themselves became extensions of their builders. Long and sleek, with shallow drafts that could slide up beaches or glide through narrow waterways, these vessels carried families between islands and settlements. Children learned to read wind patterns and ocean currents before they could properly wield an axe. The sea was both provider and highway, in a land where mountains made overland travel nearly impossible. Thunder rolling across the fjords reminded people of Thor's hammer striking his enemies. Lightning splitting the dark sky was proof of the god's power. Odin, the one-eyed wanderer, demanded courage from his followers. Warriors who died bravely in battle would feast forever in his golden hall. This was not the gentle message of Christian monks across the sea, but a faith that celebrated strength and rewarded those who took risks. Stories passed down through generations taught that honor mattered more than life itself. A man who backed down from a fight brought shame to his family name. Hospitality was sacred. Even enemies must be fed and sheltered under your roof. But once they left, old grudges could resume. Blood debts passed from father to son, creating cycles of revenge that could last decades. Young men with no land to inherit faced a choice: serve others as hired swords or seek fortune elsewhere. The wealthy gained respect by giving away silver arm rings and hosting grand feasts. But where would such wealth come from in these cold northern lands? Some found it through trade, others through craft. But the boldest looked beyond their borders. Ships that could carry families to new fishing grounds could just as easily carry armed men to distant shores. The same skills that helped hunters track elk through dense forests made warriors excellent scouts. Men who wrestled with storms and ice feared little from human enemies. The gods themselves seemed to approve of bold ventures. Stories told of heroes who crossed impossible seas to win gold and glory. Bravery brought divine favor, while cowardice invited supernatural punishment. This harsh land had shaped a people ready to risk everything for the chance of something better. As summer nights grew short and autumn storms approached, young warriors sharpened their weapons and studied the horizon. Somewhere beyond those gray waters lay opportunities their fathers could barely imagine. Part 2, A Fragile Balance, Kings, Chieftains, and the Search for Wealth. In the scattered kingdoms of 8th century Scandinavia, power rested on a knife's edge. No single ruler controlled these northern lands. Instead, dozens of local kings and powerful chieftains carved out territories from Denmark to Norway's remote fjords. Each man claimed authority over his own followers, but none could command absolute loyalty from the others. This fractured political landscape created constant tension. Every king knew that ambitious neighbors watched for signs of weakness. A failed harvest or military defeat could spark challenges from rival claimants. Power depended not on ancient bloodlines or written laws, but on a leader's ability to reward his warriors with treasure and feast his allies in grand halls. The land itself made this system even more precarious. Good farmland was scarce among the mountains and forests. When a chieftain died, his eldest son might inherit the family holdings, but younger brothers often received little more than weapons and empty promises. These landless men faced a harsh choice: accept a life of poverty or seek their fortune elsewhere. Wealth flowed through Scandinavian society in predictable patterns. Successful leaders distributed gold rings, silver armbands, and fine weapons to their most loyal followers. They hosted elaborate feasts where warriors consumed endless amounts of ale and mead. These displays of generosity bound men together through obligation and mutual benefit. A chieftain who could not reward his followers would soon find himself abandoned. But where did this wealth come from? The harsh northern climate produced limited surplus crops. Few merchants traveled these remote regions carrying exotic goods. Most local resources barely sustained the population through long winters. This created an impossible situation. Political survival required generous gift-giving, yet the homeland offered few sources of portable treasure. Competition between rival leaders intensified these pressures. When one chieftain returned from a successful raid bearing chests of silver, his neighbors faced uncomfortable questions from their own warriors. Why should they serve a poor master when wealthy leaders beckoned? This dynamic pushed even cautious rulers toward increasingly bold ventures. The solution lay beyond Scandinavia's borders. Stories filtered back from traders and mercenaries who had traveled south. They spoke of monasteries stuffed with golden crosses, churches where silver chalices caught the light, and communities that stored their wealth in easily accessible buildings. These tales painted a picture of undefended riches waiting just across the sea. Young warriors without inheritance listened to these stories with growing excitement. Here was a path to the treasure they needed for respect and independence. A successful raid could transform a landless younger son into a leader worthy of followers. The same maritime skills that helped them survive in their homeland could carry them toward unimaginable wealth. As political fragmentation deepened and competition intensified, external raiding shifted from opportunity to necessity. The fragile balance that held Scandinavian society together depended increasingly on wealth flowing in from distant shores. Soon, ambitious chieftains would discover just how vulnerable those rich southern lands really were. Part 3: Whispers Across the North Sea. Early contacts with Britain and Europe. Long before the first Viking longship struck terror into Christian hearts, Scandinavian merchants and wanderers had been crossing the North Sea for generations. These early travelers carried amber, furs, and walrus ivory south, returning home with silver coins, fine weapons, and tales of unimaginable wealth. Trade routes connected the fjords of Norway to the markets of Frisia, Denmark to the kingdoms of Britain, and Sweden to the great rivers that led deep into Europe. Archaeological evidence tells this story clearly. Frankish swords have been found in Norwegian burial mounds, their superior steel prized by northern warriors. British silver coins appear in Danish hoards, while Scandinavian brooches and beads turn up in English settlements. These objects reveal a world already connected by commerce and curiosity. The Norse traders who made these journeys were sharp observers. They noted how different the Christian lands appeared from their own harsh territories. Monasteries sat undefended on exposed coastlines, their walls built to keep out wild animals rather than armed men. Monks displayed golden crosses and silver chalices openly during religious ceremonies. Churches housed treasures that would make a Scandinavian chieftain weep with envy. Some northerners served as mercenaries in European armies, learning firsthand about local politics and military weaknesses. Others stayed for seasons at trading posts, picking up languages and customs while mapping harbors and river mouths. A few married into local families, creating networks of information that stretched across the sea. These peaceful contacts sometimes turned violent. When negotiations failed or trust broke down, Norse traders occasionally resorted to threats or force to collect debts. Local communities learned that these northern visitors could be dangerous when crossed. Yet most encounters remained commercial, building relationships that would later prove crucial in unexpected ways. The contrast between North and South was striking. While Scandinavian chieftains struggled to gather enough silver arm rings to reward their followers, Christian monasteries displayed wealth as a sign of divine favor. Where Norse halls echoed with the clash of weapons, abbey churches rang with peaceful chant. This disparity did not go unnoticed by men whose culture celebrated bold action and material success. Through decades of contact, ambitious Scandinavian leaders had gathered detailed intelligence about their southern neighbors. They knew which monasteries held the greatest treasures, which harbors offered the safest landing, which kingdoms were distracted by internal conflicts. What began as knowledge gained through peaceful trade slowly transformed into military intelligence. By the late 8th century, this accumulated wisdom had reached a critical threshold. The same sea roads that carried merchants and their goods could just as easily transport warriors and their weapons. The monasteries that welcomed traveling traders with hospitality had revealed their vulnerabilities to men who increasingly viewed wealth as something to be taken rather than earned through patient exchange. The stage was set for a fundamental shift in how Scandinavians would interact with the wider world as commercial relationships gave way to calculated predation. Part 4. Omens and Portents, 8th century upheavals in Europe. The years leading up to 793 painted a picture of a continent caught between triumph and turmoil. Europe stood at a crossroads where unprecedented wealth existed alongside growing instability, creating conditions that would make the events at Lindisfarne not just possible, but perhaps inevitable. Charlemagne's expanding Carolingian Empire dominated much of continental Europe, spreading Christian influence with unprecedented force. His armies pushed relentlessly into Saxon territories, forcing conversions at sword point and establishing monasteries as centers of both faith and administration. This aggressive expansion created a ripple effect across the continent, displacing old power structures and pushing pagan communities toward the margins. For Scandinavian societies watching from across the seas, these changes represented both a threat to their traditional ways and a demonstration of Christianity's immense wealth and political power. The natural world itself seemed to reflect this underlying tension. Crop failures swept across northern Europe in the late 8th century, creating widespread hunger and forcing communities to seek new sources of sustenance. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded strange portents in the sky during these years, fiery dragons and unusual lights that monks interpreted as divine warnings. These omens fed a growing sense that the established order was under strain, that change was coming whether people welcomed it or not. Within England, political fragmentation weakened the very kingdoms that housed Christianity's greatest treasures. Northumbria, once the most powerful realm in Britain, found itself torn apart by succession disputes. Rival claimants fought for the throne, while local nobles chose sides based on personal advantage rather than unified defense. This internal strife meant that coastal regions, including the monastery at Lindisfarne, operated with minimal military protection. Kings focused their attention on land-based threats from other English kingdoms, leaving sea approaches largely unguarded. The monasteries themselves had become symbols of this dangerous contradiction between wealth and vulnerability. Centuries of royal patronage and faithful donations had filled these religious houses with gold, silver, and precious manuscripts. Yet they remained deliberately unfortified, viewing military defenses as contrary to their spiritual mission. Monks moved freely along coastal paths, their communities welcoming strangers with generous hospitality that reflected Christian ideals, but also revealed exactly where valuables were stored. This combination of factors created what we might recognize today as a perfect storm, A fragmented political landscape left coastal defenses weak. Internal conflicts distracted rulers from external threats. Natural disasters and religious omens created an atmosphere of uncertainty and foreboding. Meanwhile, across the North Sea, communities of experienced warriors and sailors possessed both the maritime skills to exploit these weaknesses and the cultural incentives that made such exploitation not just acceptable, but honorable. As the summer of 793 approached, Europe presented an irresistible target for those willing to take what others had accumulated through centuries of patient labor. The stage was set for a collision between two fundamentally different worlds, one that had grown wealthy through faith and agriculture, another that measured success through courage and conquest. Chapter 2. The Sacred Island. Lindisfarne Before the Storm. Part 1. St. Cuthbert's Legacy, the Birth of a Holy Island. In the year 634, a small group of Irish monks crossed the choppy waters from Iona to establish a monastery on Holy Island. They called it Lindisfarne, and few could have imagined the sacred power this windswept piece of land would accumulate. The monks brought with them the Celtic Christian tradition, building simple wooden structures on the tidal island that connected to the mainland only at low tide. The monastery truly found its soul when Cuthbert arrived. Born a shepherd boy, Cuthbert became a monk, driven by an intense desire to serve God. He lived as a hermit on the nearby Farne Islands, spending years in solitary prayer and fasting. Stories spread of his miraculous healings and his ability to communicate with seabirds and seals. When he reluctantly accepted the position of Bishop of Lindisfarne in 685, pilgrims began traveling from across northern England to seek his blessing. After Cuthbert's death in 687, something extraordinary happened. His body, when exhumed 11 years later, showed no signs of decay. The monks declared this a miracle, and Cuthbert was proclaimed a saint. His tomb became a shrine that drew thousands of pilgrims each year, all carrying coins, jewelry, and precious objects as offerings. The island's isolation became part of its spiritual appeal. Surrounded by gray North Sea waters, cut off from the mainland twice daily by tides, Lindisfarne felt removed from worldly concerns. Monks could focus entirely on prayer, study, and copying sacred texts. The rhythmic sound of waves and crying gulls created an atmosphere of otherworldly devotion. Yet this same isolation carried a hidden danger. While the tides protected the monastery from casual visitors, they also meant no quick escape route existed when danger approached. The monks had no weapons, no fortifications, no military training. Their only defense was their reputation for holiness and the belief that God would protect his servants. By the late 8th century, Lindisfarne had become one of Europe's most famous religious centers. Kings made pilgrimages there. Scholars traveled from distant lands to study in its library. The monastery accumulated incredible wealth through donations, creating a concentration of treasure unlike anywhere else in northern England. The monks lived simple lives of prayer and work, unaware that their very success had made them a target. Their isolation, which seemed like divine protection, would soon reveal itself as fatal vulnerability. The same waters that carried pilgrims to their shores could just as easily bring raiders seeking the golden treasures that pilgrims had left behind. Part 2. A Jewel of Christendom, Scholarly Light in a Dark Age. The golden treasure that had accumulated on Lindisfarne was just part of what made this island extraordinary. By the late 700s, the monastery had become something remarkable in a world where most people could not read or write. While Europe struggled through what many called the Dark Ages, Lindisfarne glowed like a beacon of learning and artistic brilliance. The monks here were not just holy men. They were scholars, artists, and teachers who preserved knowledge that might otherwise have disappeared forever. Their library contained hundreds of books when most places had none. These were not simple texts either. The monks created magnificent illuminated manuscripts that combined religious devotion with breathtaking artistry. The most famous of these works was the Lindisfarne Gospels, a masterpiece that took years to complete. Brother artists carefully painted each page with intricate designs that swirled and danced around sacred words. They used precious gold leaf and brilliant colors made from rare materials. Each letter was crafted like a tiny jewel. When opened, these books seemed to glow with divine light. Daily life on the island followed a strict rhythm of prayer, study, and work. The monks rose before dawn for morning prayers, then spent hours copying manuscripts by candlelight. Their fingers grew stained with ink as they carefully wrote out religious texts, preserving Christian teachings for future generations. Some specialized in creating the elaborate decorations that made their books so beautiful. These men came from noble families across northern England, bringing education and connections that made Lindisfarne a center of influence. They served as advisors to kings and bishops throughout Northumbria. Young nobles sent their sons here to learn Latin and theology. The monastery had become a university before universities existed. The monks also served as missionaries, traveling dangerous roads to spread Christianity to pagan tribes. They built churches in remote villages and taught local people to read and write. Their influence extended far beyond their small island, shaping the spiritual and intellectual life of an entire kingdom. Pilgrims came from across Europe to study at Lindisfarne and view its treasures. They brought gifts of gold and silver, which the monks used to create even more beautiful religious objects. Chalices, crosses, and book covers gleamed with precious metals and gems. The island had become a treasure house of both knowledge and material wealth. This combination of learning and riches made Lindisfarne unique in 8th century Europe. The monks believed their devotion and scholarship created a sacred space protected by God himself. They could not imagine that these very treasures, accumulated through centuries of peaceful dedication, would soon attract visitors with very different intentions than worship and learning. Part 3. Gold, Books, and Relics, Symbols of Wealth and Sacred Power. The treasures of Lindisfarne grew heavier with each passing year. Pilgrims arrived from across England and beyond, carrying silver coins, golden rings, and precious stones as offerings to St. Cuthbert's shrine. They believed these gifts would earn them divine favor and protection. The monks carefully placed each offering in special rooms within the monastery, where piles of treasure glittered in the candlelight. Books became the most prized possessions of all. Each manuscript took months or even years to complete, with monks painstakingly copying religious texts onto sheets of vellum. They covered these books with leather bindings decorated with gold leaf, silver clasps, and jeweled crosses. The famous Lindisfarne Gospels represented hundreds of hours of skilled labor, its pages illuminated with colors so vivid they seemed to glow with divine light. These books were worth more than entire villages. The monks crafted golden chalices for communion wine and silver plates for holy bread. They created ornate crosses that stood taller than a man, their surfaces encrusted with gems brought by wealthy visitors. Reliquaries holding fragments of saints' bones were fashioned from the finest metals, each one a masterpiece of craftsmanship that took years to complete. St. Cuthbert's remains held the greatest power of all. Pilgrims traveled hundreds of miles just to pray near his tomb, believing his spirit could heal the sick and grant miracles. Stories spread across Europe about the saint's continuing power, drawing even more visitors with their offerings. The monks built elaborate shrines around his resting place, decorating them with the most precious materials they possessed. This accumulation of wealth created an unintended problem. While Christians saw these treasures as sacred objects that brought them closer to God, others viewed them differently. Across the North Sea, Scandinavian communities faced harsh winters and limited resources. To them, reports of Lindisfarne's riches represented something else entirely, an opportunity. The monastery's isolation, which the monks considered a blessing for prayer and contemplation, made it an easy target. No walls protected the buildings. No soldiers guarded the treasure rooms. The monks believed their faith provided all the protection they needed. They could not imagine that anyone would dare attack a place so sacred, so obviously under God's care. Yet the very fame that brought pilgrims also spread word of Lindisfarne's wealth to less welcome ears. Traders and travelers carried stories of golden crosses and jeweled books to distant ports. These tales eventually reached communities where men looked upon the sea not as a barrier, but as a highway to opportunity. The monks continued their daily prayers, unaware that their accumulated riches had transformed their peaceful island into a beacon for those who measured value very differently. The stage was set for a collision between two worlds, one that treasured these objects for their spiritual meaning, and another that saw only gold waiting to be taken. Part 4. Northumbria on the eve of disaster, Kingship in turmoil. While the monks at Lindisfarne continued their prayers and manuscript work, the kingdom that should have protected them was falling apart. Northumbria, once the most powerful realm in northern England, had become a shadow of its former glory by the late 700s. The trouble began with the death of strong kings and the rise of weak ones. Brothers fought brothers for the throne. Nobles assassinated rulers they disliked. In just 50 years before 793, 7 different men claimed to be king of Northumbria. Some lasted only months before meeting violent ends. This constant fighting meant no single leader could build lasting defenses or create organized armies. Each new king faced the same problem. Local lords had grown powerful during the chaos. These regional strongmen cared more about their own lands than supporting a distant monarch. They hoarded their wealth and kept their soldiers close to home. When the king called for troops, many simply ignored him or sent token forces that arrived too late to matter. The kingdom's borders became increasingly difficult to defend. Northumbria stretched from the Scottish Highlands to the River Humber, covering vast distances of coastline and countryside. Without loyal local commanders, much of this territory remained unguarded. Coastal defenses, if they existed at all, consisted of scattered watchtowers and small garrisons that could barely protect themselves. Meanwhile, other English kingdoms were growing stronger. Mercia to the south had built effective military systems under capable rulers. They maintained organized armies and fortified key locations. Wessex was beginning its rise to dominance. Northumbria, torn by internal feuds, fell behind in military innovation and defensive preparation. This political weakness created a dangerous situation for places like Lindisfarne. The monastery relied on royal protection, but kings were too busy fighting each other to worry about distant islands. The monks had no weapons training and no interest in warfare. Their entire focus remained on spiritual matters, manuscript copying, and caring for pilgrims. The irony was stark. Lindisfarne's reputation for holiness and wealth had spread far beyond Northumbria's borders. Yet the kingdom could not protect what made it famous. Royal courts knew of the monastery's treasures, but so did traders, travelers, and eventually raiders from across the North Sea. When lookouts would finally spot strange sails approaching the Northumbrian coast in June 793, no king would be ready to respond. No organized fleet waited in nearby harbors. No coastal army stood prepared for battle. The political chaos that had weakened Northumbria for decades was about to deliver its most devastating consequence to the holiest site in the kingdom. Chapter 3. The Day the Northmen Came. The Attack of 793, Part 1. The Longship Appears. Viking Sails on the Eastern Horizon. The morning of June 8, 793, began like any other on the holy island of Lindisfarne. Monks moved quietly through their daily prayers, tending to their manuscripts and gardens, while the North Sea lapped gently against the rocky shores. The monastery had stood for over a century as a beacon of learning and faith, its stone towers visible for miles across the calm waters. Brother Higbald was the first to spot them. Strange shapes appeared on the eastern horizon, moving with purpose through the morning mist. At first glance, they might have been merchant vessels or fishing boats returning with their catch. But as the sun climbed higher, these craft revealed themselves to be something entirely different. The ships cut through the water with frightening speed. Long and narrow, they rode low in the waves with shallow hulls that allowed them to glide over sandbars where deeper vessels would run aground. Each boat stretched nearly 70 feet from bow to stern, powered by both wind and muscle. Striped square sails caught the breeze, while rows of oars dipped and pulled in perfect rhythm. Most terrifying of all were the carved dragon heads that crowned each vessel's prow. These wooden beasts snarled across the water with painted eyes and bared fangs, designed to strike fear into anyone who saw them approaching. The monks had never witnessed anything like these war machines of the northern seas. Word spread quickly through the monastery as more brothers gathered along the shoreline. Some suggested the strange vessels might carry traders from distant lands, perhaps seeking to exchange goods or shelter for the night. Others felt a growing sense of unease as they counted the ships and noticed the glint of metal among the crews. These were not merchants. The men aboard these dragon ships wore leather armor and carried round shields painted in bold colors. Their hair was long and braided, their beards thick and unkempt by Christian standards. Many bore the scars of previous battles, and all carried weapons designed for close combat. The Vikings had perfected the art of surprise attack. Their shallow draft vessels allowed them to approach coastlines where no one expected danger. They could beach their ships directly on sandy shores, leap out with weapons ready, and strike before defenders could organize resistance. This mobility gave them enormous advantage over settled populations who never imagined raiders could appear so suddenly from the open sea. As the dragon ships drew closer to Lindisfarne, panic began to spread among the holy community. Some monks fled toward the mainland, hoping to reach safety before the strangers landed. Others barricaded themselves inside the stone buildings, praying for divine protection. A few brave souls stood their ground, clutching crosses and calling upon God to turn away whatever evil approached their sacred home. The peaceful island was about to become the stage for violence that would echo through centuries. These northern warriors brought with them a new kind of warfare that Christian Europe had never faced, and their arrival marked the beginning of an age when no shore would be safe from the dragon ships. Part 2. Blood on Holy Ground. The sacking of Lindisfarne. The dragon ships scraped against the rocky shore as dawn broke over Lindisfarne. The first Vikings leaped into the shallow water, their iron weapons gleaming in the early morning light. These were not the merchants or pilgrims that occasionally visited the Holy Island. These were warriors from across the North Sea, their faces painted for war, their voices raised in harsh battle cries that shattered the morning prayers. Brother Higbald was the first to die. The elderly monk stood at the monastery entrance, clutching his wooden cross, when a Viking axe split his skull. His blood splattered across the carved stone doorway that had welcomed pilgrims for generations. The sacred threshold became a place of slaughter in seconds. The raiders poured through the monastery like a flood. They smashed through wooden doors with their weapons, their boots thundering across floors where monks had walked in silent prayer. The sound of splintering wood mixed with screams as Vikings found monks hiding in their cells. Some brothers tried to flee toward the altar, hoping that God would protect them in his most holy place. Their hopes proved empty. At the high altar, where golden chalices held consecrated wine and silver crosses caught candlelight, Vikings grabbed everything of value. They ripped jeweled covers from ancient books, tearing apart manuscripts that monks had copied with loving care. Sacred relics that pilgrims traveled hundreds of miles to touch were stuffed into leather sacks like common plunder. Brother Aelred fell defending the altar, his throat cut as he tried to shield a golden reliquary containing the bones of Saint Cuthbert. His killer wiped the bloody blade on the altar cloth before moving on to search for more treasure. the holy space became a marketplace for murder. Some monks ran toward the sea, hoping to escape by swimming to the mainland. Vikings caught most of them in the surf, dragging them back to shore in chains. These survivors faced a worse fate than death. They would be sold as slaves in foreign lands, never to see their homeland again. The raid lasted only hours, but it felt like an eternity to those who lived through it. When the Vikings finally departed, their ships heavy with stolen gold and silver, they left behind a scene of devastation that would haunt witnesses for the rest of their lives. Bodies lay scattered across floors, where monks had once knelt in prayer. Holy books floated in pools of blood and seawater. The silence that followed was more terrible than the screaming had been. This sacred island, where Saint Cuthbert had once performed miracles, where kings came to pray and scholars came to study, lay broken and defiled. The attack had lasted mere hours, but its impact would echo across centuries, marking the beginning of the Viking Age and forever changing how medieval Europe viewed its own safety. Part 3. A Shattered Sanctuary, Flight, Captivity, and Horror. The raiders had taken what they wanted from the monastery, but their work was far from finished. As smoke still rose from the burning buildings, surviving monks faced a horror that would haunt the living far longer than the quick death their brothers had found. Those who had hidden in the cliffs and caves during the attack watched in terror as Vikings dragged their captured brothers toward the waiting ships. Some monks were bound with rough rope, their hands bleeding from the coarse hemp. Others stumbled forward under the weight of iron chains, their torn robes providing little protection against the cold North Sea wind. Brother Aelred, who had fled to the rocks when the first screams echoed across the island, later described seeing his fellow monks forced into the shallow water. The Vikings showed no mercy to age or frailty. Some older brothers, too weak to keep pace, were simply pushed beneath the waves and left to drown. Their bodies washed against the shore where they had once gathered seaweed for the monastery garden. The younger, stronger monks faced a different fate. The raiders saw value in healthy men who could work or be sold. These captives were loaded onto the longships like cargo, destined for slave markets in Dublin or Norway. Many would never see their homeland again. Those fortunate enough to have wealthy families might eventually be ransomed, but most would spend their remaining years in bondage among people whose language they could not understand. What shocked the survivors most was the casual desecration of their most sacred possessions. Vikings tore apart the shrine of Saint Cuthbert, scattering his relics across the beach like worthless stones. They used golden chalices as drinking cups and wiped their bloody hands on altar cloths that had been blessed by generations of holy men. News of the devastation spread with the fleeing survivors. Monks who escaped carried tales of horror to monasteries across Northumbria and beyond. Each telling seemed to add new details of cruelty and sacrilege. The story grew in the telling, but the core truth remained unchanged. A place thought protected by God himself had been violated by pagans. The psychological impact cut deeper than any sword. For centuries, Christians had believed that divine protection surrounded their holy places. Monasteries had grown wealthy and complacent, never imagining they needed earthly defenses against earthly enemies. The sight of Saint Cuthbert's bones scattered in the sand shattered more than religious artifacts. It broke the fundamental assumption that God would shield his most devoted servants. As spring turned to summer, the full magnitude of the loss became clear. Lindisfarne had been more than a monastery. It was a symbol of Christian civilization in northern England. Its destruction announced that nowhere was truly safe, that even the most sacred ground could be trampled by those who recognized no higher authority than their own strength and cunning. Part 4. God's Wrath or Heathen Fury. Contemporary Reactions. The news from Lindisfarne spread across Europe like wildfire, carried by fleeing monks and horrified messengers. In monasteries from Ireland to Italy, scribes scratched frantic letters into parchment, trying to make sense of what seemed impossible. How could pagans destroy God's house without divine intervention? Alcuin of York, the most learned scholar of his age and advisor to Emperor Charlemagne, received the terrible news while serving at the royal court. His hands trembled as he wrote letter after letter, his usual elegant Latin betraying raw emotion. "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain," he penned to King Ethelred. But Alcuin's horror went deeper than mere shock at violence. The scholar tormented himself with questions that would haunt Christian Europe for generations. Had God abandoned his faithful servants? Alcuin wrote to the Archbishop of Canterbury, his words heavy with anguish. "Consider carefully, brothers, whether this unheard-of evil has come upon our land because of our sins." He saw the attack not as random pagan violence, but as divine punishment for Christian failures. Across the monasteries of England and Francia, religious leaders examined their consciences with desperate intensity. They pointed to signs of moral decay among the faithful. Priests had grown lazy in their duties. Nobles pursued earthly pleasures instead of spiritual growth. Common people neglected their prayers and fell into sin. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, that careful record of English history, struggled to explain the catastrophe. Its scribes wrote of strange omens that had appeared before the attack: dragons flying through the air, unusual lightning, and whirlwinds. These portents, they declared, foretold the coming disaster. The pagans were not acting alone. They were instruments of God's wrath. This interpretation spread rapidly through Christian Europe. Church leaders preached that the Northmen were God's scourge, sent to punish a wayward Christian people. The same God who had once used Babylon to punish Israel now wielded Viking swords against his unfaithful servants. This theological framework helped explain the unthinkable: how pagans could triumph over the most holy places in Christendom. The psychological impact proved as devastating as the physical destruction. If God could allow heathens to defile his most sacred shrine, what protection could any Christian expect? Monasteries that had felt secure for centuries suddenly seemed vulnerable. The comfortable assumption that divine favor guaranteed earthly safety crumbled along with Lindisfarne's walls. Yet this crisis of faith also sparked renewal. Across Europe, Christians began examining their spiritual lives with new urgency, seeking to restore the divine protection they believed their sins had forfeited. Chapter 4. From Raid to Age, The Legacy of Lindisfarne. Part 1. The Shock That Echoed Across Christendom. News of the Lindisfarne attack spread like wildfire across medieval Europe. Monks who survived the raid sent desperate messages to nearby monasteries. These letters carried more than just accounts of death and destruction. They warned that something new and terrible had emerged from the northern seas. Within months, the story reached every major Christian center. Chroniclers in Francia wrote of the fury of the Northmen. English monks recorded how heathen men came to the Church of God in Lindisfarne. Each retelling added weight to what many began calling an apocalyptic sign. The attack was not seen as a random pirate raid. It felt like the beginning of something much worse. Alcuin of York, one of Europe's most respected scholars, captured the shock in his letters. Writing to the English court, he described the raid as punishment for Christian sins. He asked how such pagans could travel so far to destroy God's house. His words carried deep fear. If Lindisfarne could fall, nowhere was safe. Monasteries across Britain and Ireland began taking precautions immediately. Abbots moved their most precious treasures inland. Some communities relocated entirely, abandoning coastal sites they had occupied for centuries. The wealthy monastery of Iona, sitting exposed on a Scottish island, became a frequent target in following years. Each new attack confirmed what many had suspected since Lindisfarne. Kings and nobles also recognized the threat. The old assumptions about Viking raiders changed completely. These were not isolated sea robbers seeking quick plunder. They were organized forces capable of striking anywhere along Europe's extensive coastline. Royal courts began discussing coastal defenses for the first time in generations. The chroniclers made Lindisfarne into something larger than a single raid. They wrote it into their records as the moment when the Age of the Northmen began. Monks at monasteries from Ireland to Germany referenced the attack when recording later Viking raids. It became their measuring stick for catastrophe. Church leaders used Lindisfarne to explain a changing world. They preached that God was testing Christians through pagan violence. Some saw it as divine punishment for moral decay. Others viewed it as a call to strengthen faith against heathen forces. Either way, the raid became deeply embedded in Christian thinking about their relationship with the world. The story took on mythic qualities as it passed through generations. Chronicles written decades later still describe the attack in vivid detail. They emphasize the desecration of holy places and the murder of defenseless monks. These accounts shaped how medieval people understood the Viking threat long after the original participants had died. By the end of the 8th century, Lindisfarne had achieved something no single raid should have accomplished. It had announced the arrival of a new age. The attack marked the symbolic beginning of Viking expansion that would reshape European politics, trade, and culture for the next 3 centuries. Part 2. The Tide Unleashed. From raids to settlements. The single strike at Lindisfarne had opened floodgates that would surge across Europe for centuries. What began as one summer raid in 793 quickly multiplied into annual campaigns of terror and opportunity. Viking longships returned each spring like migrating birds, carrying warriors hungry for the wealth they had glimpsed in Christian lands. The pattern established itself swiftly. Monasteries fell first because they held the greatest treasures with the weakest defenses. Iona suffered attack in 795, then again in 802 and 806. Irish coastal settlements watched helplessly as dragon-headed ships appeared on their horizons. The raiders struck Rathlin Island, then moved to the Welsh coast. Each success taught them more about Christian weaknesses and revealed new targets. Within 2 decades, the seasonal raids had grown bolder and more organized. Multiple fleets coordinated their attacks. Vikings learned to strike inland, following rivers deep into territories once considered safe. They discovered that Christian kings moved slowly, hampered by the need to gather armies and seek counsel. By the time defenders arrived, the raiders had vanished with their plunder. The transformation from raider to settler happened gradually, almost accidentally. Warriors who spent summers raiding began staying through winters rather than returning to Scandinavia. They established bases on islands and coastlines, places where they could repair ships and store goods. These temporary camps became permanent settlements. Dublin emerged as the first major Viking stronghold around 841. What started as a seasonal base became a thriving town filled with craftsmen, traders, and families. Ships that once carried only warriors now brought women, children, and farmers. The raiders were becoming residents. York fell to Viking armies in 866, becoming Jorvik under Scandinavian rule. These weren't just military conquests, but demographic shifts. Entire communities transplanted themselves from Norway and Denmark to British soil. They brought their laws, their gods, and their way of life. The political landscape buckled under this pressure. Christian kings who had once focused on fighting each other now faced a common threat that demanded new strategies. Alfred of Wessex pioneered the system of fortified towns called burhs, creating a network of defended positions. Other rulers copied his methods, fundamentally changing how medieval societies organized for defense. The Vikings' expansion wasn't random violence, but systematic exploitation. They identified the richest targets and most vulnerable routes. Their success attracted more settlers from Scandinavia, creating a feedback loop that sustained the movement for generations. Each victory proved that Christian lands offered better opportunities than the harsh fjords of home. By 850, the world that had existed before Lindisfarne was gone forever. The age of undefended monasteries and peaceful pilgrimage routes had ended. In its place rose a more militarized, Vigilant Europe, where Christian and pagan cultures would clash and blend for centuries to come. Part 3. Faith Undone and Reforged, Monastic Decline and Viking Fear. The monasteries that had once stood open to all travelers now barred their gates at the first sight of unknown ships on the horizon. Across Europe, the news from Lindisfarne had spread like wildfire through networks of clergy and pilgrims. What had once been places of peaceful worship and learning became fortresses against an uncertain future. Brother Alcuin's letters from the court of Charlemagne captured the growing panic. Monasteries began moving their most precious treasures inland, away from rivers and coastlines. The great abbey of St. Martin at Tours relocated its sacred relics to hidden chambers. Irish monks carried their illuminated manuscripts to remote mountain retreats. The wealth that had made these places targets was now their greatest burden. The changes went deeper than simple precautions. Monasteries that had welcomed strangers without question now posted guards and built walls. The rule of Saint Benedict, which had governed monastic life for centuries, required adaptation. How could monks maintain their vows of hospitality when any visitor might be a spy for Viking raiders? Some communities made desperate choices. The monks of Iona abandoned their island home 3 times after repeated attacks. Each return brought new fortifications and fewer brothers willing to stay. Other monasteries simply vanished from historical records, their communities scattered or slaughtered. The golden age of undefended Christian scholarship was ending. Yet from this fear came unexpected strength. The relics that monks hid so carefully became objects of even greater veneration. Stories of saints protecting their treasures from pagan hands spread throughout Christian Europe. The cult of martyred monks from Lindisfarne grew, inspiring new forms of devotion. Churches began commissioning works of art depicting these holy deaths, turning trauma into spiritual triumph. Monastic schools, once focused purely on copying classical texts and biblical commentary, now included practical subjects like fortification and military strategy. Young novices learned to recognize the distinctive sails of Viking longships alongside their prayers. The scholarly tradition continued, but it was tempered by constant vigilance. The economic impact was enormous. Monasteries had been centers of trade and manufacturing, their workshops producing everything from illuminated manuscripts to fine metalwork. Now these same workshops turned to making weapons and armor. The peaceful prosperity that had attracted Viking attention was being systematically dismantled and rebuilt for defense. This transformation revealed Christianity's remarkable adaptability. Rather than simply retreating, the faith evolved to meet new challenges. Warrior saints gained popularity alongside peaceful martyrs. Prayers for protection from northern raiders entered the liturgy. The church that emerged from this crisis was poorer in gold, but richer in resilience, shaped by the memory of that June morning when everything changed at Lindisfarne. Part 4. A New Age of the Northmen. The Viking century begins. The morning that changed Lindisfarne marked far more than a single raid. It opened doors that would never close again. From Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, longships began carrying warriors south with increasing frequency. What started as opportunistic strikes evolved into systematic campaigns that redrew the map of Europe. The success at Lindisfarne sent powerful messages across Scandinavia. Monasteries held immense wealth, yet maintained minimal defenses. Christian kingdoms, despite their military strength, left their most valuable assets vulnerable. Word spread through Norse communities that the southern lands offered riches beyond imagination for those bold enough to seize them. Within a decade, Viking raids struck Ireland's monasteries with devastating regularity. Rathlin Island fell in 795, followed by attacks on Inishmurray and Inishbofin. The pattern established at Lindisfarne repeated across the Irish Sea. Monks fled inland, carrying sacred relics and manuscripts to safer ground. Coastal communities learned to watch the horizon with growing anxiety. The raids expanded beyond religious targets as Vikings discovered the wealth concentrated in trading centers. Dublin, York, and Paris became familiar names in Viking sagas. What began as summer raiding seasons gradually extended into permanent occupation. By the 850s, Vikings were not merely visitors, but settlers, establishing bases that served as launching points for deeper penetration into European territories. The transformation was remarkable. Ships that once carried only warriors began bringing families, livestock, and farming tools. The same longships that terrorized monasteries now transported merchants seeking legitimate trade opportunities. Viking settlements became cultural mixing grounds where Norse traditions blended with local customs. This expansion created a complex web of relationships between Scandinavian settlers and established populations. In some regions, Vikings integrated peacefully through marriage and commerce. In others, they imposed their authority through military conquest. The flexibility of Viking society allowed both approaches to flourish simultaneously. The impact reached beyond territorial conquest. Norse law codes influenced legal systems in occupied territories. Scandinavian craftsmanship techniques spread throughout Europe. Trade networks expanded dramatically as Vikings established commercial routes stretching from Greenland to Constantinople. The raiders who destroyed Lindisfarne's isolation inadvertently connected distant regions of the known world. By 900 CE, a Viking presence had become permanent across vast stretches of Europe. Norman France, Anglo-Saxon England, and Gaelic Ireland all bore Scandinavian influence. The brief raid that shocked Christendom in 793 had grown into a cultural revolution spanning 3 centuries. The age that began at Lindisfarne would not end until Christianity itself spread northward into Scandinavia. When Norse kings finally accepted baptism, they closed the circle that began with the destruction of a small monastery on England's coast. The Viking Age, born from that June morning's violence, transformed both raiders and victims into something entirely new. Chapter 5: Ashes of Lindisfarne, Memory and Meaning. Part 1: Ashes of Lindisfarne, Memory and Meaning. The smoke cleared from Lindisfarne's shores, but the memory would burn far longer than any building. What happened on that June morning in 793 became something much larger than one violent raid. People across Britain and beyond struggled to understand how God's servants could suffer such brutal treatment on their holy ground. Church leaders like Alcuin wrote desperate letters trying to make sense of the disaster. They saw the attack as God's punishment for their sins. Maybe people had become too proud, too wealthy, too comfortable in their faith. The raid must be a warning to return to simpler, purer ways of worship. This explanation spread through monasteries and royal courts, creating a shared understanding that something fundamental had changed in their world. The survivors carried more than just physical scars. Monks who escaped the massacre told their stories again and again. They described the terror of seeing their brothers killed, their precious books destroyed, their sacred spaces violated. These accounts became powerful tales of martyrdom and faith tested by fire. Other monasteries wrote down these stories, copying them and sharing them with distant houses. The treasures that raiders missed or left behind took on new meaning. Broken crosses and damaged manuscripts became holy relics of survival. Monks carefully gathered these fragments, treating them with special reverence. The famous Lindisfarne Gospels, created decades before the raid, became even more precious as a reminder of what was lost and what endured. Artists began creating new works inspired by the tragedy. They painted scenes of monks praying while Vikings approached. They carved stone crosses showing triumphs over suffering. These images appeared in churches across northern England, keeping the memory alive for generations who never witnessed the original attack. Pilgrims started arriving at Lindisfarne to see where the disaster happened. They came seeking spiritual connection to the martyred monks and to understand how faith could survive such violence. The island transformed from a center of learning into a place of remembrance and reflection. Writers in later centuries looked back at June 8, 793, as the moment everything changed. They called it the beginning of the Viking Age, the day when northern raiders announced their presence to Christian Europe. What seemed like one isolated attack revealed itself as the first note in a much larger story of conquest, settlement, and cultural exchange. Today, visitors still walk across the causeway to Lindisfarne at low tide, following the same path those Viking ships took over 1,000 years ago. The ruins of the medieval priory built on the ancient monastery site draw thousands each year. They come not just to see old stones, but to connect with a moment when violence and faith collided, creating ripples that spread across centuries and shaped the very idea of what it meant to be European.